I'm going to begin by giving you a basic definition of moral injury so that you can understand the context in which the work of moral resilience is so crucial, because the outcome of lacking moral resilience is to have moral injury, which is a very devastating thing. Next slide. So this is a short working definition for moral injury. It comes in the wake of high stakes situations in which things go very wrong and harm results. So the first place this was studied was, of course, in war with veterans of war, but there are many other places where moral injury can occur. Anyone who has a moral conscience is susceptible to it. It can emerge in those who do the wrong, those who are harmed by those they trust, who have power or authority. So it can be something that is done wrong to you, not just something wrong that you might have done. It can affect those who are witnesses to that harm. This is what you might call bystander effect. And it can affect those who have an emotional investment in an event and hear about the harm. So it can come from many different ways. I actually know people who never actually had to do something, but just even getting ready and imagining having to do something pretty devastating has affected them deeply. So it's serious, and it disrupts our love and meaning systems. So as human beings, love is crucial to survival and to being a decent person and having a sense of our own humanity. So to have that disrupted is a major break. Next slide. So what are some of the signs of moral injury? So some of the social issues you may notice if someone has it is that they may be isolating, not wanting to socialize or be with other people. They may have a lot of aggression, even a toxic kind of anger that they're not able to control, or they may be misusing substances to control the pain. Or they may feel unsafe all the time. They may just anxious and even hypervigilant sometimes. They lack trust. They mistrust themselves and other people. They will often be suspicious of others' motives or behaviors. And they're not able really to engage in intimate relationships because their capacity to trust is so impaired, and you have to have that to have good relationships. The spiritual challenges of moral injury include loss of faith. You can imagine how it might feel if you're in a really terrible situation and you really believe that your faith is powerful and that if you pray, the worst thing won't happen, and then the worst thing happens. And a loss of faith may be that you stop believing in God at all, or it may be that you're just so angry at God you don't want to have a relationship with your previous tradition. You may also give up on ordinary relationships. We all know that something devastating that it happens within a relationship, even if it's not something that the two people did to each other, if it's an external event like the loss of a child or something like that, it can really disrupt a relationship if it's not healed. And moral injury shows up often in high divorce rates in people who experience it, or them just not connecting anymore to people they previously related to. It can also mean people lose that kind of personal discipline and structure that they have in their lives, that they don't like authority, don't like structures, resentful of it, or themselves just give up all the personal disciplines they used to have. Existential issues include fatalism, despair, and another sign of it is important is unrelenting grief, sorrow that just doesn't have comfort in it at all. The self becomes a negative thing. People will sometimes say, I became evil, or I have an evil thing inside me. They may loathe themselves, really hate themselves, or say things like, I don't know who I am anymore, but who I was just isn't here. And they may get so severe in their moral injury that they contemplate taking their lives because they just don't feel like they deserve to live anymore. Next slide, please. So there's some main points about moral injury I think it's important to remember. And the first one is one that is a little bit surprising for me to have come to, not because I don't believe it, but because generally psychologists, psychiatrists, and social scientists tend to avoid making existential or essentialist claims about human beings, about human nature. That's sort of the job of theologians. And as a theologian, I sort of do that sometimes, but I've been surprised in my work with so many psychiatrists and psychologists that their work in moral injury is leading them to conclude that we are all born moral because it's essential to being loved, and we don't survive without love from the moment we're born. And I actually agree with them. I do believe that human beings are born moral, which is why moral injury is such a serious personal crisis and a collective crisis. It's not just something that can happen to one individual. It can happen to whole groups of people. So it's really important to remember we are born moral. And moral injury, therefore, is also not a disorder. It's a risk of the human condition and human frailty, but it results in a sort of war inside that is anguishing. And it comes from that moral place in us, our humanity, that is now fighting with our experiences that devastated us. It's we call it the war inside, because the experiences that cause moral injury, that have led to the moral injury, can't be integrated. They just sort of take over and haunt people, and they just are sitting there, and a conscience can't make sense of it, can't integrate it into a moral meaning system that makes sense of life. So alleviating that suffering, alleviating the moral anguish of moral injury, requires us to actually reconstruct our humanity. And part of that is that because the moral injury trauma has taken over a sense of self, it tends to blot out a narrative of life that can remember any goodness before it happened. So part of the task of alleviating the suffering is helping people reconstruct a life narrative where the moral injury isn't the only defining thing about that life. And that's the process that begins a way to create a sense of meaning and purpose that will make sense of our lives. So reconstructing our humanity is how we recover from moral injury, but that reconstruction can't ignore the moral injury. It can't just say, okay, well, that's in the past now and we can move on. You don't really move on from it. It's never gonna be forgotten. It may still cause pain in your life every time you think about it, but instead of being the biggest factor in your life that defines who you are, it becomes a piece of information for understanding who we are and developing a greater sense of wisdom and integrity from having reflected upon it in a deep way. And that kind of reflection takes a very long time. It's not a simple process. It isn't, well, okay, now I'm gonna sit down and write about it and think about it, and it will be over. I have a former student when I was at Bright Divinity School who was in Iraq, and his job was an ordnance disposal specialist. And he came back from that experience devastated, devastated for a lot of reasons, and did what often happens when you're in that state. He drank and was angry and was hard to get along with. And he said one of the things that saved him was that he was able to, that there were people in his life that were able to be with him and stay with him even when he was hard to be with. And eventually he became able to go back to college. He got married and he came to seminary. And I met him when he was starting seminary. And he'd never heard of moral injury, but when he heard of it, it clicked for him. It made him begin to re-examine all that stuff he'd been carrying that he really hadn't processed. And so he and I have maintained a relationship since he graduated, and he's gone on to Emory University to do a doctorate in theology and ethics. But what I find interesting about how he continues to process his war experience is that every time he talks about his moral injury, there's something new in the way he talks about it. There's some new story or some new insight or some paradox or complexity that he's struggling with. And I think moral injury is a serious enough injury for most of us that that's a lifelong process. It's not ever going to just be finally finished and resolved, but every time he thinks about it, it becomes another way that he understands himself better. So he is, I think, in doing an amazing job of integrating it, thinking about it, sharing it, and reconstructing his own humanity. And that is what it takes to recover. So I'm gonna, you can go back to the screen now, Sam. So I'm now gonna turn it over to Dr. Cinda Hilden Rushton of Johns Hopkins University, and let her explain to you this amazing work that she's been doing on moral resilience, because I think the only real protection from moral anguish descending into moral injury is to develop greater moral resilience. And she's one of the best people I know on the subject. So I'm really thrilled that she had the time today to share her work with you. And so Cinda, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rita. And welcome to everyone who's pausing to reflect on some of these really hard issues. It's a time where I think we need our sense of community, and we need to know we're not alone, and have some ways to really confront the reality of what's in front of us. So welcome, and thank you for inviting me to be here. So Sam, I'm going to have you start the slides, but as we do that, I want you to just reflect for a moment about how you are right now and sort of what you're bringing into this space today, because I think for many of us, we're feeling pretty distracted and overwhelmed. So Sam, if you can start. And just go to the second slide, please. Next slide. There you go. I don't know about you, but this is how I feel. Sort of that feeling of, you know, so much going on, so much distraction, and so much suffering right now. I have spent a lot of the last 5 weeks working with a group of colleagues trying to think about how we're going to allocate our scarce resources. And every day it feels like there's more and more distractions, there's more and more questions that we really can't answer. And yet we must, and we have to continue forward in the midst of this uncertainty and the many conflicts that we're experiencing. So just to acknowledge that's kind of where we are right now, and to just give yourself a moment to locate where you are in this moment. So next slide, please. So next slide. As we begin, what I'd invite you to do is just to remember why you're doing the work that you're doing. It's really easy in the midst of all that chaos to forget why we're doing the work that we're doing. And as Rita was talking, one of the things that helps us be able to show up and to serve in the midst of this is actually to stay really closely connected to that sense of why we're here, that sense of purpose. So just to invite you to reorient toward that as we talk about the concept of moral resilience, so that you have a really strong anchor for why this work matters that you're doing. Next slide. So as Rita mentioned, I've spent a lot of my professional career working with clinicians around the issues of moral distress, which in the way I think about it, moral suffering is sort of the umbrella that encompasses different degrees of moral suffering. And moral injury, in my opinion, is really one of the more extreme examples of moral suffering. But it can range from, even a sense of discomfort about what's happening around us to a real sense of distress that we feel that's a violation of our sense of integrity as people, all the way to what Rita was talking about. And so I began to ask myself, yes, this suffering is real and it's present, but what's the alternative? And I think this quote by His Holiness is really a good example of trying to meet that adversity. This quote is, when we meet real tragedy in life, we have one of two choices. We can react either by losing hope and falling into self-destructive habits, or using the challenge to find our inner strength. And so as we transition to the next slide, I want you to think about how you approach these experiences of adversity. Next slide, please. So I began to think about what the alternative was, and I sort of landed on this concept of moral resilience. There wasn't really very much written about it in the literature, so I began to try to conceptualize it and did some research, which I'll share a little bit of it with you today. So next slide. We began to think about this concept of moral resilience, and what I'm sharing here today is our work in progress. This is a concept that is evolving and is becoming more and more refined. But our current definition is the capacity of an individual to sustain or restore integrity in response to some kind of moral adversity. And boy, I'll tell you, there's a lot of moral adversity right now. What really it represents for me is, I think, represented in this image here of this bowl. In Japan, there's a very lovely practice that when a bowl is broken, instead of it being discarded as no longer useful, there's a process called kintsugi, or golden repair, where the pieces of the pottery are put back together using cement that is laced with gold to actually highlight the places in the vessel that have been broken. And instead of hiding them or putting them out of our sight, the process is of one to actually honor those places that had been broken, and to see this vessel being put back together in a new way, perhaps a stronger and more beautiful way, but not to turn away from the broken parts. And so for me, moral resilience is really about putting back into harmony the parts of ourselves that have been threatened or violated in this experience of moral adversity. I want to be clear, though, that it's not being complacent. It is not acquiescing to unethical or unacceptable situations, or putting a positive spin on a really unacceptable situation. Or importantly, moral resilience is not about putting all of the responsibility on the individual, but rather to see this as a pathway for us individually and collectively to create an environment of integrity. So next slide, please. As we think about moral resilience, some of the important dimensions include this capability to discern the boundaries of integrity. And we're going to talk about integrity in just a moment. But importantly, within that, the exercise of conscientious objection or refusal. knowing where the outside boundaries are of integrity for us. And each of us may have slightly different thresholds for what those boundaries look like. But nonetheless, really moral resilience is an invitation to accept things as they are. And Rita spoke beautifully about that. When we accept the reality that we're in, and if you think about this COVID-19 pandemic that we're in, accepting that this is a pandemic doesn't mean we're endorsing it or overlooking the reality of it, but rather accepting that this is where we are right now. And being able to acknowledge the boundaries of our own individual and collective power and influence. Because one of the features in moral injury that Rita was speaking about is this kind of persistent fighting with reality, being able to just be outraged all the time, and how that can easily deplete us and exhaust us. And another feature is to recognize that often in these circumstances, I know as a nurse and as a healthcare provider, we want to produce good outcomes. And sometimes we are very attached to the outcomes we think are best. But part of being morally resilient is to recognize it's kind of a both and experience, that the evidence of effective moral agency is reflected both in our conscientious efforts, regardless of how it turns out, and the outcomes themselves. And so I offer that because often I feel like we hold ourselves to expectations that in many instances are probably unattainable and unrealistic given the circumstances. So moral resilience is being able to actually know what those boundaries are and to extend some compassion toward our own limitations. So next slide, please. So we did some empirical work trying to understand what the capacities for moral resilience were in healthcare professionals. So we collected definitions from about 184 interprofessional clinicians, and we did a thematic analysis. And these are the 6 capacities that came out of our research. And I'm going to talk about each of them individually, but I want to give you a sense that the grounding for moral resilience really is personal and relational integrity. It also includes the sense of buoyancy, which is not necessarily just about being able to bounce back, but actually to adapt to the circumstances that are in front of us, and in some instances to actually be able to grow as a result of the adversity that we experience. Self-regulation and self-awareness, as well as moral efficacy and being competent and being able to confront ethical questions. And the final one being self-stewardship. So next slide, please. So when you think of integrity, what comes to your mind? And it's interesting because integrity is a concept that has many meanings. And, you know, in its most sort of basic definition is a sense of harmony and wholeness, that there's a kind of coherence in what we say, what we do, and how we are in the world. So when we think about integrity, it does start first with us as individuals. And one of the features of integrity is really knowing what we stand for. And I think this is a really important starting point, because if we know what we stand for, as opposed to what we stand against, it can give us an anchor in the midst of adversity to actually ground ourselves and our actions. It gives us the direction to appreciate and to claim the values that are most important to us, so that we can actually live them rather than just talk about them, but actually use them as a moral compass to guide how we respond rather than react in these very difficult situations. Integrity also is an invitation to be curious, to inquire, to discover what will serve rather than what we want or what we think should happen, but what will actually serve in that circumstance. And I'm going to come back to that in just a couple of minutes. Integrity often requires us to ask hard questions and to speak out for what we stand for. And that is a very important point of how do we actually speak out in a way that is both constructive and respectful, especially when we are experiencing intense feelings of moral outrage. Integrity also requires us to listen to the call of conscience. And Rita mentioned that in moral injury, there's a sense of violation of our conscience. But integrity actually requires us to have a very strong relationship with our conscience, to be able to detect the signals of our conscience being activated in our bodies and how we can use that information to focus our attention on where we ought to act or not act, or how we ought to respond when we conclude that our conscience is actually being threatened or violated. Integrity requires courage, and courage often includes risks. Doesn't mean that we have to be martyrs all the time, but it does mean that sometimes we have to harness our courage to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Integrity also involves taking principled action, or sometimes the best thing to do is not to act, but always to be responsible and accountable for our actions or inactions. So I want you to think about how integrity shows up for you and how you notice in yourself and others moments of integrity in the midst of the adversity that we are all experiencing right now. So next slide. The other dimension of integrity, and this was really interesting in our data, was that clinicians talked a lot about how to hold their own seat, how to stay true to themselves, but also to extend integrity to others. And so this idea that our personal integrity is intertwined with the integrity of others is really important. And you can think about instances where our integrity is supported when we are around people who actually act in accordance with their values. And it can also be degraded when we are around people who are acting out of integrity. And so there's this sense of knowing who we are as a prerequisite for relational integrity, but it acknowledges in a very fundamental way our interdependence and our shared humanity. And I think this is an important part right now in our world. The coronavirus, I think, has illuminated again our exquisite interconnection with each other, and that our relational integrity actually depends on a kind of solidarity of purpose and presence to whatever's happening, but a valuing of everyone's contribution. And so in relational integrity, the goal here is for no one to be left out, that we actually honor the diversity and in a very inclusive way of all of us, all of our contributions. And this, for clinicians, I think is particularly important right now, because what I'm hearing from some of my colleagues and others who are not in the healthcare field is the sense of I'm not doing enough. And yet, all of our contributions, in whatever capacity they are, matter right now. And so this sense of relational integrity. Next slide. Kaz Tanahashi is a calligrapher and Japanese translator. And I asked Kaz at one point to help me understand what integrity meant in the Japanese culture, because I was doing some work there. And this is the Enzo that Kaz painted for me. And in his description of integrity, he defined integrity as whole oneness. And I really think right now that thinking about integrity as interconnected with all of us is a very important concept for us to keep in the forefront as we think about how we move in these really challenging times. Next slide. So with that as a foundation, then the next element is, how do we stay buoyant? How do we stay in our resilient zone? And I want to thank my colleague, Lori Leach, who introduced me to this concept, that all of us have a kind of resilient zone where we're able to kind of ride the wave of the adversity without being too dysregulated or exhausted. And I don't know about you, but staying and finding this resilient zone lately has been a little bit more challenging. But yet, it's kind of the home base that we want to get back to. So in the next slide, I want you to kind of think about what are the, next slide please, what are the things that can sort of bump you out of your resilient zone. And so Rita very appropriately mentioned that sometimes our distress and our moral injury really comes not only from actually causing harm directly, but witnessing it. And this collective witnessing of the suffering of people who are dying, people who are really struggling with access. How do we manage the volume of deaths that we're seeing surrounding this pandemic? How do we manage all of these sources of adversity? And the likelihood is that those things will bump us out of our resilient zone. And what we see generally is there's sort of one of two responses. One is that we're sort of stuck on hyperarousal, that sense of hyperactivity, of hypervigilance. There's often a feeling of anxiety and panic, sometimes irritability. We notice our heart rate and our respiratory rate are increased. And in this state, we can be pretty inflexible. On the other hand, we may end up from witnessing or being part of situations that we find really morally objectionable, we may respond with hypoarousal. So depression, a sense of disconnection, and Rita talked about that sense of disconnection, exhaustion, fatigue, numbness. Many clinicians talk about just going through the motions. I wasn't really there, but I was just going through the motions. And what often happens is that we may have both of these responses at different times. What's important is to be able to recognize that we all have some similar patterns, and that what can occur as a result of this is that we can provoke some of our own compensatory mechanisms that can result in guilt or shame or avoidance, burnout. All of those things may be outcomes of our sense of dysregulation. So just to think about yourself and what you're seeing personally, but also what are you seeing in your colleagues? What kinds of patterns of responses? And my guess is that you're probably seeing this whole range of responses. So next slide. So buoyancy is important in moral resilience, but so is self-regulation and self-awareness. And this takes us right to the question of how do we begin to develop the neural pathways in our nervous system so that when we're bumped out of our resilient zone, we actually have some resources that help us to be able to reorient toward what really matters, but also importantly to get our nervous system back online so that we're in that resilient zone. And one of those pathways is actually the development of mindfulness. Being able to actually confront what is happening in the moment without judgment, with a sense of caring intent, and being able to recognize those moments and respond to them with a little bit more ease and compassion. So I want you to just take for a moment. This is a G.R.A.C.E painting that I really love, because when we're in a place of actually being in mindful awareness, we're really above the clouds, and we're able to, in the moment, see the clarity of those clouds and see the blue sky that's above. So I'm just going to invite you for a moment to just focus on your inhale and your exhale just for a moment, and let yourself really just sink into the moment right now. Letting yourself just exhale whatever you're carrying, and let yourself relax as much as you can, just for a moment. And if you can, to notice if there's any place where there's particular tension in your body. Might be in your jaw, your neck, or your shoulders. Just to take a moment to check in with yourself. How am I today? What's true for me right now? What am I feeling? Without judgment, there's no wrong answer. Whatever you're feeling is just as it needs to be right now. And then noticing where your thoughts are. Our attention is often dispersed, distracted, and divided. So just seeing if you can take this moment to just focus on the sensation of breathing. This ability to pause just for a moment is so important in the midst of what we are currently doing. We have to find a place of rest in the midst of, as Frank Asaseki often says, finding rest in the midst of. So this foundation of mindfulness is one of the things that actually supports our ability to be in integrity with ourselves and with others. So as we move now to the next slide, I want you to just keep connected to that feeling of being stable in the midst of. Moral efficacy is the ability to have the skills and knowledge and confidence and capability to exercise our moral agency. And that means that we have to have the capacities to actually embody and know our values, to perceive the situation as clearly and as sensitively as we can. This idea of moral sensitivity, the ability to locate in the situation what really matters, what values are at stake, what are the salient features, how we can use our emotions and our empathy to understand and take the perspectives of those who are involved. And then using those typical discernment and reasoning skills that we associate with ethical analysis and discernment. And then using that knowledge and wisdom to propel us toward action. So having that foundation along with self-regulation and a sense of knowing what our boundaries are is absolutely vital for moral resilience. And then the last piece in the next slide is about self-stewardship. And I would be interested to hear from all of you. what I find in my work is there's sort of this allergy against self-care. And so when we were doing our analysis, we thought, you know, we need a more robust way to talk about this sense of our own self-regard and our duty to our own well-being. So self-stewardship is really embodied in a commitment to know ourselves, to really know what our limits are, to know what our gifts are and what our challenges are, but to actually know ourselves and our limits, and to responsibly and mindfully manage our own personal resources, and to respond not with judgment or self-blame, but with compassion to our limits. We are human beings, and we are deserving of our attention toward our own well-being because we are human beings. But for those of us who are in the helping professions, our investment in our own self-stewardship is so that we can actually serve others, because we can't give what we don't have. And so that means we have to intentionally choose actions that are wholesome and healthy, that actually nourish us and to give us the energy and the ability to continue to show up in a healthy way without devastating ourselves in the process. And right now, this issue of self-stewardship, I think, is particularly challenging because there are so many needs. And for those of us who are in a helping profession, our inclination is to push ourselves beyond our own capabilities, which is actually not a sustainable way of being. And so this idea of self-stewardship, I think, is really particularly important right now. Next slide. In some of the work that I've done with frontline nurses, trying to develop these capacities in nurses, one of our colleagues, Jen Simmons, who's a surgical ICU nurse, said this: "We are all resilient and courageous. Sometimes we just need the tools and support to access what is already inside of us." And I think that's absolutely true. As you work with others and with yourself, is to remember that we wouldn't be doing this work if we weren't resilient. It's now a matter of how do we actually amplify and strengthen our resilience in the midst of situations that really challenge us in new and important ways. Next slide. So I want to end this part of our my presentation with an offering. I've been had the privilege of teaching with Roshi Joan Halifax now for about 20 years, and teaching in the G.R.A.C.E program since its inception with Roshi Joan and Tony Bach. And Roshi Joan created this mnemonic of grace as a way to cultivate compassion in the midst of whatever circumstances that we find ourselves in. And we teach this program in a weekend. I hope we'll get to do it again in person. But nonetheless, I think these elements of grace certainly have been a resource for me as I have been like you, in the sort of midst of trying to recalibrate in a pandemic. But the elements of grace can actually provide us with some practices that help us when we're confronting these challenges. So the foundation of grace, the G of grace, is gathering our attention. So just as we did a moment ago, sometimes it's just an inhale and an exhale, being able to actually gather the threads of our attention into the moment. The second element of grace is recalling our intention. And so on the next breath, we could actually, on the inhale, remember why we're here. And that recalling intention is really connecting us to our ethical foundation, to who we really are, to why we are here and what we intend to bring about. So being connected to that sense of support and motivation is really vital as we try to create the conditions for compassion to arise. The A of grace is somewhat counterintuitive, because attuning to ourself as helping professionals, we tend to focus on the other. But in this model of compassion, we have to first attune to what's going on with us. What are we bringing into this situation? Noticing our own situation, and then to enlarge our awareness to include the other. Once we have taken stock of where we are and what is happening for us. And that means then, being attuned to the experience of the other, and both from an affective point of view, but also from a cognitive point of view, the idea of perspective taking. What is it that this person in front of me might be experiencing? What might their challenges and their suffering be? And then the C of grace is a very important step that moves us from this process of actually attuning and being able to perceive the situation clearly, to answer the question, what will really serve? And I find this question to be a very profound question, because I know a lot of times I get attached to what I think I should do and miss the opportunity to actually serve the situation. What is needed here? What will serve? How can I use my gifts, my talents, my insights in a way that actually benefits the other person? And then the E of grace is moving from considering to action, and to do that in a way that is connected to our ethical values, and doing so in a constructive and respectful way, so that we can bring about the best outcomes for everyone. And then to end whatever encounter we have had with another person. So I just offer this mnemonic for you as a practice, as a way to really be with the challenges that we're all in at this point. Last slide. So I want to leave you with this. Peter Elyard says, the future is not someplace we are going to, but one we are creating. The paths to it are not found, but made. And the activity of making them changes both the maker and the destination. So as we journey together, I think one of our questions is, what kind of future are we creating? And how can we use the opportunity to actually recognize the degree of moral suffering that is present in ourselves and others, and to commit to a process of healing and cultivating our moral resilience, so that on the other side, we will actually have healthcare professionals and communities that are healthy and whole, rather than decimated by this experience. I think there's one more slide, and then we can shift to, this is information about our book if anyone's interested in it. I think I'd like to shift away from the slides now and see what kind of questions people have.
Linda, thank you so much. This was so helpful.